Thirdly, I come to museums. I've got some other points I could make about this visual material, but I think we need to move on. Museums. It's clear from the archive and from the material that they weren't just interested in museums as social institutions that might be studied by a sociologist. They were interested in the way in which the museum itself could be used to develop a sociological argument. And the best, for those of you who know of it or who've heard of it, the best illustration of this is the so-called Outlook Tower that Patrick Geddes erected in Edinburgh in the early part of the 20th century. And essentially, if I can sum it up, what he did with this tower, and it's a wonderful idea really when you think about it, at the top, he put a camera obscura. The physical tower is still there. He put a camera obscura looking out over Edinburgh. And then floor by floor, he laid out the tower as a sort of exposition of the location of Edinburgh and Scotland and Europe and the whole lot within the world. So the idea, it was a kind of ecological argument that he developed through the building and through the way in which the visitor would navigate the building, an ecological argument about a region, if you like, and its location within the world. And Geddes and Bramford were, I think, profoundly convinced that in order to do good sociology, you had to be synthetic. You had to bring everything together, and the everything that you had to bring together wasn't just what people did in their society. It's the physical world that people inhabited. You had to bring in the geology. You had to bring in the ecology. You had to bring in the... and you also had to bring in the historical understanding that people themselves had of the world that they were located in. And so I think one of the riposts, very often I think of my colleagues about these people is, these people were really, Auguste Comte, it's a bit about evolution, and isn't that terribly determinist and everything. They were interested in theories of evolution profoundly, and they took a Victorian evolutionary perspective. But in many ways, I think they didn't treat people as though they were passive effects of the material world in which they were located. They really were interested in the way in which people made sense of the world in which they were located. I could go, I've too much material to go into in any detail there, but I can talk about it if people want to later on. And there's some wonderful passages by Bramford where he's taking you to Piccadilly Underground Station in 1917 in London and saying, look at the adverts. And he's saying, look, this is part of the collective imagination of Londoners. Look at the adverts for the war effort. Look at the adverts for this or for various commercial products. And this, I think for the period, it's quite an interesting thing for these sociologists to have done. What I'd like to, I've probably got to tie things up pretty quickly, I think. But what I would like to do is to suggest that these people are worth looking at and thinking about, and their work, although it can be a bit off-putting, once you get into it, it is actually no more off, for those of you who've had to read it, no more off-putting than Durkheim or Max Weber in terms of its language and form of expression. They are worth reading, and I think one of the reasons that they're worth reading is, and perhaps I ought to add that there's been recently some reassessment of these writers in the pages of the Sociological Review, which won't surprise you, but there's been some reassessment and debate. But one of the reasons they are, I think, worth considering is that I think their ecological emphasis and their evolutionary interests and their commitment to placing human problems within the context of a long-term perspective, an evolutionary perspective, I think that speaks to many of the issues that we, doesn't need too much emphasizing, many of the issues that we confront today. And I just wish I had said more often to my students over the decades, please go to the museum. I mean, at least if we as sociologists said that to our students, we might get a bit further. And this is where I have to come clean, of course. I am somebody who was taught by a sociologist who insisted on teaching us about Sumeria, I mean, or the invention of fire. Norbert Elias, the German emigre, pushed out of Hitler's Germany in the 30s, who never lost his interest in Auguste Comte, always insisted that properly directed an evolutionary perspective was worth retaining, not in the eugenic sense, obviously. And one of the areas I think one might want to explore here, just to give one example, would be, it seems to me that if nature and society defines some of the issues that confront us today, if that area is crucial for us, then one of the things, again, as sociologists, we might begin to think about is, well, how, for example, are animals actually involved in and enlisted within our social structures? And I think we forget that the thing we call social structure as sociologists includes not only human beings, but includes animals and the associated relationships of exploitation and subordination that we think of. And I think the more one thinks in those terms, one, to use a sort of sometimes what's called an actor network theory perspective perhaps, the more one thinks in those terms, the more heterogeneous we realize human societies are. And I think that heterogeneity, our understanding of that heterogeneity might occasionally be enhanced by a visit to the museum. I was always a bit shocked by how few of my students ever had visited museums, but what can one do? So what I'm trying to do really is to make out a case for sociologists. In a way, I'm talking to my colleagues, but it might help here. I want sociologists to take the museum seriously. And without going into too much hyperbole, I perhaps would say we ought to think not what our discipline can do for museums, but what the museum can do for our discipline. Thank you. I didn't get there. It's all right. He would have got cross because I would have gone too
long. Thank you, Gordon. Well, I visited Outlook Tower, Gordon Patrick Gadd's Outlook Tower in Edinburgh many years ago, not some, many years ago. And I was fascinated by this camera obscura in which you could see the panorama of Edinburgh projected on a table. And what I thought was that what I was seeing then was different from what they saw 1 century before. It was just like a sort of traveling time or a continuous view of the town ever changing during the years and the decades and the centuries. That's very interesting. Well, what I think that sociology museum for me should be museum of utopias. That's very strange because utopias don't exist, and the museum of what don't exist could be impossible. But for example, great exhibitions, world fairs, they were and they are utopias because they foresee the future of the town, the future of the architecture, the future of what will be the world. I remember 1939 Great World Fair in New York was titled The World of Tomorrow because it was foreseeing the world after the war. Well, the war, there wasn't still the war because it was 1939. I mean, in the States, maybe in Europe. But it was looking forward. And so great exhibitions are in a certain way utopia machines and the utopia museums, temporary museums. And and it could be very interesting. Maybe we'll talk about that later. And no, it's okay. I finished.